G'day, I'm Martyn Iles and this is The Truth of It. And today I want to bring you a talk that I recently gave in Adelaide, Australia. It's a talk that's all about truth, of course, but it is also about what's really wrong with the world today and what do we have in our hands to fix it. And you might note that this is a change of pace. That's true, and it's because, well, to be perfectly honest with you, it's not every single week that I feel like I have something really meaningful to contribute to the news cycle of the last week. Sometimes the news cycle doesn't throw up interesting things. Sometimes it doesn't throw up things that I think I have some insight on. And in those weeks I thought, well, rather than pretend that I have something to say when I don't, what I will do instead is use those weeks as opportunities to either give a talk here in the studio or to show you one that I have given myself recently in my travels, which I know and I'm confident will help you to continue to grow more broadly in your knowledge of the truth of it. And so without further ado, here it is. So today's conference really is under the title Not Ashamed. And it's impossible to talk about that phrase, not ashamed, without thinking about where it appears in the Bible, which is in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to all who believe. That is what the Apostle Paul said. And I want to pick that up. I want to pick up the whole chapter. Because it seems to me one of the things we're trying to do is come to grips with a very fast-changing culture, a very rapidly changing society. And we're trying to come to grips with that, and we're trying to understand what our faith, what Scripture, what God has to say to help us to meet that culture and that society. That's why I do the truth of it. I want to particularly tell younger people that their faith does comprehend the world they see every single day. But when the Apostle Paul wrote that phrase, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, he actually wrote a phrase like that in a society very, very much like our own. Now, he wrote to pagan Rome. And there's a lot of people out there who are looking at the cultural shifts that are taking place in Australia and in the West at the moment, and they're starting to say this looks very much like, and more like, a neo-pagan society. And you say, well, in what ways? Well, let me just take a few examples. Do you know in ancient Rome there was that practice, which we're all familiar with, where people would have children and due to the inconvenience, they might decide to leave that child out to die. Children, infants, after birth were disposed of on the city's rubbish heaps. And you say, well, we wouldn't do that today. I mean, we're so sophisticated. Well, we've obviously got this practice which is in the medical industry and it's sanitized and it's brought up to acceptably modern standards, but it is abortion. And not only that, but what people don't realize is that hundreds of babies every year around this country are born alive and left to die on operating theatre tables because of botched abortions and the like. This is happening in our time. And in ancient Rome, it was the Christians who went out and got those children and raised them as their own. In modern Australia, it's so often the Christians who stand for life. So it was a society where children were seen as a burden, but also it was a society where sexual expressionism was rife. It's interesting to me that the rainbow has taken this pinnacle place in society. It's really become the litmus test of whether you're an acceptable individual. Well, how do you react to it? And in ancient Rome, they had polyandry and they had androgyny and they had all of these things. And these things were so often associated with, the most sacred place in society, the temples and the temple worship. That's where you found it. That's where it took place. And, it's almost like an ancient version of what we'd today call pride. And if you were a Christian in ancient Rome, you could expect to find yourself at the fringes of society. The Christians didn't participate in temple worship and ritual and all the rest of it, and they quickly found themselves on the outer, misunderstood, not really well comprehended, and all sorts of rumours were spread about what they really got up to in their church services and meetings and what they really thought and believed about things. And I found myself debating in the National Press Club recently, and questions being put to me were along the lines of, but what do we do when a Christian organisation takes this action or that action? And it was completely preposterous. And I had to actually say to them, what do you think we believe? Do you think we're all half mad? Where are these crazy cultish practices, being found in modern society? And the room laughed at me because they actually think that we hate. They actually think that we're bigots. They actually think we've got all kinds of phobias. They really do believe it. It was the same in ancient Rome. It even interests me that, you had the Circus Maximus, and I was in Sydney speaking the other day, and I said, the Circus Maximus had about roughly the same capacity as the ANZ Olympic Stadium in Sydney. And so you had a society which coined that idiom, bread and circuses, because that's what the people look for. And there's a very modern Australian phenomenon where if you hit someone with something that's just a bit too hard to think about, they'll turn the football on and they'll check out. We live in a society that doesn't like to face some of those hard truths. Sure, there was even a thriving feminist movement in ancient Rome, which I dare not say any more about. But you had so many cultural trends. And one of them was even this. The only same-sex marriage that I can find that's ever been recorded in history that's been celebrated in the West before, say, 2001 was in ancient Rome. You had Emperor Nero. He married two boys. One he called his husband, the other he called his wife. And that was after he'd kicked his own pregnant wife to death in what you might call a domestic violence outbreak. A society so much like our own. And so when we come to these principles of culture that are explained to us in light of God's call on our lives in Romans chapter 1, we find so much in pagan Rome that we can learn for neo-pagan Australia, or neo-pagan Adelaide, as the case may be. And Paul basically goes on from Romans 1:16 to start to unpack through the rest of that chapter the culture in which the people are living. He goes on to say many other things in the book, which we'll get to, but the culture in which they're living. And he says, there's something about this culture. It demonstrates something. It proves something to us. It proves something that, and I take the next breath, that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. And I want to pick something up in that. The word is revealed now, currently. Not merely future, although future is for sure, but there's something right now that proves this to be true. And that's not just a cry of condemnation from Paul, and we want to skip over it because we think, judgy, and we want to move on to the next thing. But that's not what he's doing. You read 2 Corinthians and you see that Paul's heart is intensely pastoral. He really cares. And what he's trying to do is two things. He's trying to actually explain. He's trying to explain the society in which we live. It's a lesson, an explanation of what we see around us. And it's also a warning to culture. It's a love of neighbour statement. That actually, in this, there is pain now. In this, there is woe and there is disaster now. People suffer now under this sin of ungodliness and unrighteousness. And he's warning people that it has consequences. And in my job all the time, we all are constantly witnessing the consequences of this world. And we recently, for example, and this always lingers with me, we had Walt Heyer come out to Australia. Walt, for those who don't know, was one of the first ever gender reassignment patients in the world. He underwent a gender reassignment in the 1950s. Walt lived as a woman, a trans woman, for a number of years before he realised, like so many others who go down that pathway, that this irreversible surgery had not solved his problems. He became an alcoholic, he became suicidal and all of those things. But eventually Walt detransitioned and Walt became a Christian. And he's a wonderful Christian man. And he now runs a counselling ministry called Transgender Regret. And he travels the world counselling people in exactly the same situation as he was in. And he has seen thousands of people now. He's even referred some people to us in Australia who have, as soon as 2 days after surgery, realised what a terrible mistake they've made. And we're in a society now where we're giving children scalpels rather than counselling. I said to Walt, why is it that this is such a widespread phenomenon? This is happening everywhere, you say, and we certainly are getting the sense that there's a tsunami coming. I said, but why are you the only one who's actually out there talking about these things? And his answer was, he said, well, Martyn, I'm 80. I said, yeah, so? He said, I'm the only one, nearly, that's well enough to talk about what happened to me because it was so long ago. It takes years for people to build up their broken lives. Because he says in more than 50% of cases when he goes and talks to people, he says, what went wrong? He said they can always answer the question. He said in more than 50% of cases they'll say child sexual abuse. He said in nearly all of the remainder of cases, they'll cite some comorbidity like autism or some kind of mental health concern. But see, rather than heal them, they got given a scalpel, unquestioningly, and went down that path. There's consequences now. This hurts now. I recently was speaking at the Walk for Life here in Adelaide just a couple of weeks ago. Amazing event. But one of the things about that walk, the part of the speech that I put in there that I found profoundly moving, was the stories of post-abortive women. And I read a number of stories there about women who have gone through grief, and some very brave women spoke at that rally and told their own stories. It was so powerful to hear stories of women who, they are driven suicidal over what was done. Women who, every time they hear a baby cry, all they can think about is the child that's now not with them. Women who have had massive complications and been driven to the end of themselves. Those stories were incredible. And we deny this to our dying day, but there's consequences now in this life. This is hurting people. It matters. Even the issue of sexuality, I often say, if it wasn't for modern medicine and sexual health clinics, we would not be able to live the way we live with our sexuality in this culture and get away with it. We just wouldn't. But science, technology, and wealth masks a great darkness. But see, we think we get away with it because we treat the immediate symptoms. We don't get away with it. It wreaks a havoc on people's psychology like they can scarcely believe. And even in this chapter, Paul says, people who go down this life, they receive in themselves the result of their error. It's here in Romans 1. These are things that God has rejected, and they are the things that will destroy us. But see, there's something we need to know about this. We look at these issues and they concern us and they move us. By the way, this is why when people say, why would you impose on people? Why do you go out there and speak the truth on these issues and impose on people when they don't want you to? Well, firstly, someone's values are going to be imposed. But secondly, I just want to say, how dare you try and check out of your obligation to love your neighbour to that degree? That you would leave people in this state, leave people to hear voices that would tell them these things and do nothing about it? That's not what we're to do. We're to love God and therefore love our neighbour. And that is why we do what we do. That is why we try and change things. But see, it's really important that we understand what the real problem is, because we can misdiagnose the problem. And misdiagnoses have caused us to give a lot of false answers to the problem. I travel around and very often people say, well, what's gone wrong? Well, we've rejected Western culture. That's what's gone wrong. I said, well, do you know what? If you believe that, you're going to preach the past. And it isn't going to succeed. Nobody cares about the past anymore. Or it's the rejection of logic. We just need to bring common sense into the situation. Persuade people with facts and reason. And I said, well, all right, you'll preach research and you'll preach surveys, and I can tell you what, you will fail. In a truth-rejecting society that says, I don't care what's true, it's not going to work. You won't change someone's mind. Or you'll say, well, no, it's just because people aren't educated. They need to be taught. Which I say, I think that's made the whole problem a lot worse. There's a lot of misdiagnoses going on. The Apostle Paul just says it how it is. He says, the real problem is ungodliness. It's a rejection of God. Men have forgotten God. The real problem is that we live in an age of spiritual darkness. It's that simple. And throughout human history, that has always been the case. It's always been the story that the real problem has been human rebellion against God and his ways. And that's why Paul says ungodliness and unrighteousness. There's an order there. Reject God and then you reject his ways. There's nothing authoritative for your life. There's no boundaries, there's no trajectory, there's no principles, except those which you invent for yourselves. And that's why the Bible, of course, says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? What's the antithesis of that? Well, deny God, and it's the beginning of sorrows. And one of the undercurrents in people's lives is actually so much of this. I've discovered, I was about to say as I've got older, but that sounds a bit stupid, doesn't it? I've discovered that regret drives people in such profound ways. There's so many people you meet, and the whole government of their activity is driven by regrets I always say to young people, if you can get through your life in your 20s and your teens without regrets, without serious lifelong regrets that torture you, you'll be a long way ahead. And that's the number one reason to avoid sin in your life, if only for personal gain. This is what happens, that there is an ongoing thing right now, and it's a problem of spiritual sickness. But see, that brings me to the point that Paul also makes, which is it's not easy living this way. It's difficult. The proverb says the way of the transgressor, that is the person outside of God's way, is hard, it's difficult, it's challenging. And the major reason given here is that the truth that we are trying to deny, which is ultimately the truth of God, always threatens to make itself known. There's this great revelation here, which is that our culture doesn't face an evidence problem. If evidence were the answer, they'd be convinced. It faces a people problem, a spiritual problem. Paul actually says, it's super obvious what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. It's as obvious, as this, to adopt Paul's language into modern terms. The convention centre we're in right now is not the product of an explosion in a brick factory. The convention centre we're in right now is the product of many brilliant minds who have been educated for years and years about a lot of very complicated things, and they've all come together, and poof, the marvel of our modern arrangement of things is that we have a convention centre. How much more so are the fingerprints of God on his creation, which an infinity of human minds will never plumb the depths of? It's ridiculous. Of course it's obvious. And we read this and we go, well, it can't be that obvious. It is that obvious. I was flying in a plane the other day, beautiful sunset out the window, and I see God. I say, oh, you're so dumb. No, you're dumb. But, Paul notes three things. He says, the obvious things are the fact that there is such a thing as eternity, there is power, creative power, and there is the divine. That's seen to everyone. Paul says, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. And never forget, and by the way, amazing story that I could tell if I had the time, but basically about the discovery of the four elements, wind, fire, water, earth, and how that so much of the thinking behind that was to try and find that animating principle behind the universe. The thing that might have been around from, eons past, got that eternal aspect. That thing that might drive the being and the change and the force of the universe, water. It could be water. It's got power in itself, waves on the beach, etc. It carves out great canyons. And it could have been here forever, who knows, air and so on. And then, of course, you get four elements. You can't have the animating principle behind the universe four times. So, thought develops and you get the Logos. And they're all talking about what the Logos is. And, of course, the great revelation of John 1 is that John says the Logos is what? It's Jesus Christ. He was in the beginning, all things were made through him. Without him was not anything made that was made. But you see, this is the quest of the ages to find the qualities that Paul is describing here. And a modern example of this is a while ago, I was driving along in the car, and on the radio, they were having an interview with one of the scientists that was working on the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, which is that great big tunnel under the mountains of Switzerland where they're trying to fire all sorts of particles together and try and find something. And they actually articulated what it was they were trying to find before they found it. And this scientist was having this conversation. He was saying, the thing that we're looking for is something that existed in the moments before the Big Bang. Something that was always there, And also we're looking for something that actually ignited, that infused the energy and the power into the Big Bang and made it happen and gave it the force that it requires. I'm thinking eternity, power, yep, great. He goes, and do you know what we, and the guy goes, yeah, and what is this thing? He said, oh, well, it's actually the Higgs boson or it is actually God. I nearly said hallelujah until he said particle. I thought, what willful blindness is that? You even call it the God particle, the thing you're searching for that animates all of existence. Paul says, look, it's obvious. It is obvious. It is not an evidence problem. But the thing that makes it even stronger, if you get to Romans 2, is people's conscience. Paul says our conscience also bears witness. And he's always telling us that there's something more. There is something more. And that is why this evidence, this reality, has to be suppressed, and it has to be suppressed fastidiously and continually. And that's what Romans 1 says. They suppress the truth about God in unrighteousness. And all of the verbs around that, they're all active doing words. You could actually translate it to say, and they go on suppressing the truth about God. It's like, when you was a kid and you're in the pool and you're trying to, for some reason, I'd always try and touch the bottom of the pool with whatever it was that was floating on the surface. And you have a volleyball, right? Very hard to get to the bottom. And to hold it under the surface, you've always got to be kind of doing this, as you're swimming along, as it threatens to pop up. And it's like that. It's an ongoing thing to keep it down, that it might not be known. And this is a day-to-day effort in the world around us. What are the taboos in society? In polite company, what are the two things you never talk about? Politics and religion. The two things that give us meaning for life. No, don't talk about that. Too controversial, too hard. Rather turn the footy on. I used to work in a big law firm in Brisbane, and one of the things that, I'm so glad I'm not anymore, let me put it that way, but I was in one of these big law firms, and this is an environment in which people work tremendously long hours. Huge, ridiculous. There was even a couple of cases while I was there of people falling asleep on the floor in their office overnight and then getting up and going again in the morning. And they worked like dogs all week. And the most exciting thing that happened in the day was that you went over the road and bought sushi. And people would talk about it for 2 hours beforehand. It's coming, lunch break, That was the life. And then on the weekend, 4:59 p.m., already the bottles of alcohol are coming out of the fridge, and that's it. They don't know who they are from 5 p.m. on a Friday until Monday morning. And I used to look at that and think, what is wrong? What's going on? Is it just me? Do you know what was going on? And people will deny it to their dying day, but that is suppressing the truth about God in unrighteousness. The evidence threatens. A sober thought threatens. A non-busy moment threatens, because it's always there. But it's a public square effort as well. It's not just a personal day-to-day, it's a public square effort. Israel Folau. What was his true crime? It's interesting, I was reading an opinion piece in The Australian by somebody who's usually quite conservative on these matters. And they said, look, I don't agree with what Israel Folau said. But, look, I think he should have the right to say it. He said, and by the way, I don't agree with what he said, because if what he said is correct, if those are the criteria for hell, then I'll see you down there. To which I was going, yes, right? But here's the problem. The one thing people will not tolerate is the notion that they might be judged and found wanting before God. The notion that actually there might be a God who demands something of us. The notion that actually there might be eternal consequences to a temporal life. Those themes will not be tolerated. Do so much of the legislative programs in our parliaments can be described according to what Paul says in Timothy, where he says, pray for kings, pray for those who are in high positions, pray that our lives of godliness will be lives of peace. Why? Because God desires all people everywhere to come to a knowledge of the truth. And so much of what the government does, whether it is to suppress Christian witness or change the law, really could be described in that phrase, they are opposing the knowledge of the truth. School freedom legislation that was in the federal parliament at the end of 2018. There was a piece of legislation which was unbelievably bold. All that it really did was target faith schools only. No other group. And faith-based schools, what would have happened if that legislation passed? Had they taught their beliefs about anything really, but particularly controversial issues, they would have been subjected to lawsuits. There's no doubt. And there was a great, fanfare and PR campaign in the media that that's not what this is about. That's what it was about. And you look at that and you think, why? Well, I'm so glad I went to a Christian school. There's a lot of people at my Christian school who were not Christians when they started, and they weren't from Christian families. But today, I just got a message on Facebook from one the other day, actually. They're now Christians, following God. There's 2 pastors of large churches in Brisbane who were converted at my Christian school in my year level. Why would you go after Christian schools? Opposition to the knowledge of the truth. Why would you go after Christian families? I did a segment on the truth of it the other day. talking about what they call conversion therapy laws, which basically have an end game of saying if you're a parent and your child identifies this way or that and you try and encourage them out of it, or you want to take them to get proper medical care or anything, then you're going to be in trouble with the law. Why would they do that? Why would that foster agency over in WA not enable a Christian couple to foster children? Do you know, the thing I'm most grateful for in my life, maybe apart from salvation, but is that I grew up in a Christian family. What do you do? Opposition to the knowledge of the truth. Target the Christian family. Whittle them down. So much of what is going on can be explained this way. Do you know, I used to actually think in my naivety that this was a fight for freedoms. That we're looking for freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom. It's interesting. The only people that really get in trouble and lose their freedom are people who tell the truth. You know, it's never the person that goes out there and says you can be an asexual, non-binary, genderqueer and find out who you really are who gets in any trouble. The only person who gets in trouble is the person who says, actually, I think there's only boys and girls. There's two genders. Boom. You're finished. These are the sorts of things that attract opposition time and again. And people said when we started the Human Rights Law Alliance, surely you'd take on cases where people just lost their freedoms but it wasn't particularly religious. Do you know what? There's barely any. It's not actually so much a fight for freedom as it is a fight for truth. And it's opposition to the knowledge of the truth that we see. And, it's almost like it's a spiritual battle and the truth is the target. Not so much freedom. It's a societal thing, the suppression of the truth. It's happening all around us. That even explains Kathy Clubb's case, which I've mentioned many times. Why get in the way of a lady who's making simple offers of help to women who might be aborting their children and saving the lives of hundreds of babies in the process? Why? Because the truth must be stopped. Why would the New South Wales Transport Minister tear down a billboard that makes a simple statement that a heart beats at 4 weeks? Truth. Opposition to the knowledge of the truth. The lies seldom get attention. I think Wendy's flat out getting them to take down sexually explicit billboards. It's so hard. But these ones get all the attention. But also I think this is why we need to expect in a culture like ours. We need to expect people to react to truth. So a lot of what we do, people say, how do you do what you do and stay positive and all this? A lot of it's just expectations management. How do you imagine people are going to react? Well, negatively. Well, because why? Well, the world's a fallen world. And if you're in a fallen world, it's going to be a bit of an uphill push to get a fallen world to accept the light when it's in darkness. What's the nature of people? Well, people are fallen. So it's always going to be difficult to get people who, the Bible makes very clear, are in the dark to see the light. And they're not going to necessarily welcome it every time. You need God to help you with that. But this project has actually ushered something in. And it's in a pagan world, it's particularly strong, and it's mentioned here in Romans. And he's not, once upon a time in our history, revelation was authoritative, and what the church had to say about things was really important, and that was the guide for life. But then the age of reason came in, and then reason became authoritative, and the way we think about things, and it was all about the brain. And Christians obediently followed and said, well, let's start making objective arguments with secular reasoning, right? Because it's the age of reason, and it works. Nietzsche was right, it wasn't going to work for long. Because you find out that your reason, when untethered from something stable like God, is just what you think. And that's what's happened. We're in a situation now where the authority is not reason, it's not God, it's you. It's how you feel about things. And so we are walked into an age now of full-blown self-worship. The age of self. They exchanged the truth about God for the lie. They worshipped and served creature rather than creator, who is blessed forever. And it turns out that this whole business of suppressing the truth is a protection racket for something. Because if the truth about God is known, then my position as creator gets dethroned. My position as Nietzsche said, must we not ourselves become gods, simply to appear worthy of it? What's it? The death of God. It's a great big protection racket so that I can put myself on the highest pedestal. It's the age of, it's the timeless sin of the human race. Adam and Eve, what was the sin? To be as gods, it says in Genesis 3. Our culture is in the throes of this. It's the age of self-love, self-esteem, self-confidence, self-care, being my best self, and the selfie. It's all about self. It's a generation in which, I don't know if you've noticed this, but the word identity is used more than any other. What's the identity? It's just who I am. And that word is all pervasive. Why? Because we care about self. We care about who I am. It's the generation, that's decommissioned blasphemy laws. Laws that said you couldn't insult God. And what's in its place? Vilification laws. Laws that say you can't insult my sense of identity. Is that not worship of creature rather than creator? Is that not a reversal of the very kind that this section is talking about? And so the worst sins you can commit in this generation, firstly, is judging. Don't judge. Because being me is a much higher priority than being judged by haters who hold me back. And what I need to do is tell myself I'm beautiful, powerful, and enough, and move on and shake it off. And we've fallen into the trap of thinking that principle of wisdom about hypocrisy that Jesus gave us says we cannot make wise conclusions about anything. And we can't make wise conclusions about whether something is right or wrong, or whether a person might be doing right or wrong. Can't judge, don't judge. There's no standard other than me. And if you judge me, you hate me. If you judge me, you're tearing me down. Another sin in this generation is telling the truth. How often have we heard the cry, I'm offended? Well, good. Sometimes we need to be offended. It's called character, change, realizing you're wrong, changing, moving on, moving upwards. No, but offended, I'm offended, is the ultimate barrier to progressing with the conversation. Do you imagine what this does to the way a new generation reads the Bible? What does the Bible say about itself? It's a sword that pierces. It's a mirror that shows up our faults so that we might change. You don't look in a mirror and see your tie crooked or your hair out of place and fail to fix it. And the Bible's meant to continually show us those things that we might fix. It's meant to be a fire and a hammer to break hard hearts into pieces and to purify people. Do you know what? In a world in which even the subject-object difference between, me and other things, a world that's been turned on its head says, no, I don't like that verse, I'll just read the other one. No, I prefer these scriptures and not those scriptures. And I feel as though we've obediently gone down that line with culture as we've actually started, I was in the Koorong gift section the other day. No offense to Koorong. Better be careful. It's a great shop, awesome shop. Shop there. I was in the Koorong gift section the other day. And it's interesting, you never have, vengeance is mine, I will repay on any of the gifts. You never have any verses that talk about anything that doesn't make you feel good. And I think we've believed that the gospel has bad bits. That the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men is not good. That we should go easy on that. It's all true. It's all good. It's all supremely good, actually. I'm so glad that vengeance is God's and he will repay. I can't imagine a world without justice. I was at a youth camp a while ago and they said, how can a good, loving God judge people? I said, how can he not? Are you serious? So Hitler was just a mistake? By the way, he's someone who followed his dreams. But anyway, that's another story. It's not good advice. Don't give it to kids. But that means Hitler's just a mistake and there's no justice. That means what this guy did up in Brisbane to his wife and children, there's no justice. There is justice. There is justice, and it makes us all live differently. It's a wonderful thing. All truth is good truth. But in a culture where we no longer see wisdom in the fear of God, but we say that which will give meaning and direction for my life is the promotion of myself. We've inverted the whole thing. And that is foolishness by a biblical definition. And that's exactly what we see. We see actually a world that has lost its mind. Professing to be wise, they became fools, says Paul. I used to own, when I was a kid, one of my first ever laptops. I was a huge fan of Lamborghinis. There was a time in my life when I thought I might own a Lamborghini one day. Those days are gone. It's all right, I'll drive a Kia instead. It's fine. My treasures are in heaven. But I had a Lamborghini laptop as a substitute for the real thing. I went to the International Motor Show, went to the Lamborghini section as like a 12-year-old, and I bought a Lamborghini laptop and Lamborghini cufflinks. And this Lamborghini laptop was made of carbon fibre. It had leather, black leather with yellow stitching. It had a genuine Lamborghini, badge on it. And when you turned it on, it revved like a Lamborghini engine. And I loved that thing. And do you know what? It was actually one of the best laptops on the market. I had to save up. It was very, very powerful, very, very expensive. But one day I was typing particularly quickly on that laptop. And as I was going for it, my finger somehow got caught under one of the keys and it snapped right off. And would you believe it, it was the E key. Do you know how hard it is to use a computer, no matter how good it is, no matter how much firepower it has, with no E key? You can't even say yes, you can't do anything. And I was in a real pickle. And do you know what? In a culture that said no to God and suppressed the truth about him, it's like we've lost the E key. We can never make sense. It doesn't matter how much firepower we put into the issue, there'll always be a flaw. It doesn't matter how clever those scientists on the Large Hadron Collider are, they'll never find God, and therefore they'll never find the answers. That's the reality of our time. And the result is chaos and destruction. And we are living in a culture that is losing its mind because its mind is not governed by the knowledge of God. What is moral? I say what's moral. How often do you hear people say we did what was right for us? I did what was right for me. Number one justification for family breakdown was right for me. Well, who cares? What about what was right? Happens to be a different thing. What's best for my life? It's to discover myself, follow my dreams, love myself. Boy, we wonder why we're raising a generation of narcissistic and fairly unfriendly people. It's no surprise. What causes should I join? I was talking to Steve about this before. Climate change, right, is the big cause. Why? It doesn't require anything of me. It's such a big issue. It's so far out of my control that all I have to do is get angry and go to a protest. I don't have to change my character. I don't have to check myself in any way whatsoever. It's easy. Those are the issues, the things that don't confront me. How should I conduct my sexuality? That's the example that Paul gives. And he gives it here because it's actually the thing that is obviously not right because of our biology. When we say God is not the creator and my biology doesn't matter and my anatomy is irrelevant, we do what we want. But we've taken it a step further in modern society. I've said I'm 6'7" with hairy hands, but I'm a woman and I'm beautiful, and you'll tell me that I am. Right? We've actually started to say, no, we're all creators now. We're in the seat of God. And what we say will go. And in such a society, the volcano of human nature erupts, unchecked, unleashed. There is no limit on what people will do. And when people don't have a limit on what they will do, I tell you what, the true nature of the self comes out. And this is really where Christianity bumps up against culture in so many ways. I'd said in a conversion therapy interview with 60 Minutes, although it went straight over their heads, I think, but I said, look, the difference in this really is what is it that is good and reliable, and what is it that we should pursue in order to be happy and to live a good life? Is it in here, or is it up there? Is it me, self, identity? Is it doubling down? Or is it to say, no, I give all that away and I sacrifice myself, as Romans 12 says. Give it all up. Why? For the knowledge of God and the calling of God on my life. I'm same-sex attracted. Well, big deal. It's very important that, we acknowledge all of that, but it doesn't change the fact that me, as someone who's not same-sex attracted, has to live the same life as the same-sex attracted person. None of us get to follow our sexual desires, whatever they may be, because we follow God. And, Christopher was on ABC Radio the other day and they said, can you not understand how that somebody, might feel really offended and that you've questioned them in their inner identity? And he said, well, of course, because that's my story. The fact that, I am not good and not okay. The fact that there's something wrong with me and I need Christ and his forgiveness. That was said to me by a leading LGBT activist who, she said, look, she said, you shouldn't even bother trying to make churches LGBT friendly because no one wants to walk into a building and find out that there's something terribly wrong with them. And I said, but there is something terribly wrong with them. And the room just sort of nearly freaked out just for a second. And I said, no. I said, there's something wrong with all of us. There's something wrong with me. I'm a sinner before God. And I need his salvation. And you know, Jesus himself, this is the difference. This is the difference. Where is good? What is to be pursued? What is worthy? Self or something outside of self? I often say to people, you know, really we only as human beings get a single compliment in the whole Bible. And I challenge you to find another one. There's only one. And my goodness, we love it. We repeat it all the time. You know, we cling to this compliment. We are made in the image and likeness of God. Hey, that's enough. Yeah, unfortunately, you turn the page and things change. There was a fall. And every descriptive word of the human condition is negative. People who are dead in trespasses and in sins. You know, people who are walking according to the prince of the power of the air, it says. People whose righteousnesses are as filthy rags. People, none that does good, no, not one. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. You know, we have reprobate minds, whatever that means. Love quoting the King James. It's up there with superfluity of naughtiness. It says that. But actually, we are sinners. And we've lost sight of that too, I think. Pagan culture infects us and makes us think too highly of ourselves and cling to too much of ourselves. And do you know what that always does? It brings God down from his throne, slowly. And if the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, we are in danger of losing our minds. And we are in danger of walking down this pathway of darkness, even just a little bit, that Paul describes in a world that's lost its mind. You know, I do fear that sometimes this comes too close to us, and we need to check ourselves. But this madness it's destroying us. I mean, what does Paul say here? He says, the list of sins filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossip, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Unchanged human nature. What does it do? And he goes on here to say, effectively, that this destruction that's being wreaked by this in a culture is enormous. And you know, it's interesting that even though that whole mantra is repeated and repeated and repeated, people are not getting happier. You know, we're dealing with the most depressed and anxious generation that the West has ever seen. A generation not only that's depressed and anxious because of deep psychological unrest that comes from this mode of living. I mean, regret for one thing. But also a generation that was handed scalpels instead of counselling because their mind was supreme. A generation that was robbed of their parents because that was their parents' preference. You know, a generation that was never disciplined when they grew up because we went along with the world's view of human nature. And we said, but I was over-disciplined when I grew up, so I'm not going to commit that sin. Well, it's not ended very well. A generation that was told to be themselves, follow their dreams, let nothing stop them. Now they respond with rage and vitriol and anger at anything that threatens their sense of self or questions the life that they're living. Romans 1 tells us that this is a spiritual disaster. And that really is the problem with our world. And that really is why we stand here and we look at a world and we say we must do something. We must do something for love of God. We must do something for love of nature. This is a world in which if we don't do that, it's going to come for us anyway. We can either step out and hit the landmines, as Christopher was saying, or we can wait and get devoured anyway. Because standing by as a bystander is not going to be enough. This world will demand, and indeed is starting to demand, approval. And if you do not approve, and you don't wave the flag, and you don't fall in line, you will be in trouble. because that's how this section finishes. They will approve. The call for approval will go out. And the LGBT issue, for example, has become the litmus test of whether you'll be accepted in society. And people will interrogate you to find out where you stand on it. Happens to politicians all the time. Vilification laws mean you cannot cause any offence. Conversion therapy says that even if you don't affirm, if you accept but don't affirm, says the policy paper, not good enough. Douglas Murray writes in his recent book, he says, and we're seeing so much now of this being pushed in our face as if to say, well, see how you like this, bigot. I was getting on a plane coming from Sydney to Adelaide, Mardi Gras in Sydney tonight, and they had rainbow flags just draped all over the check-in area, and all the staff were wearing their rainbow badges and all this kind of stuff. And I heard Douglas Murray's words in my head. It was sort of like, how do you like this, bigot? I thought, well, this is a culture that will make us approve. So what should we do? And this is what I want to finish with, rather than leave us all down on the floor. We need to have an answer. We need to know what we can do. And there's great hope in the answer. And the answer was given first, as the Apostle Paul so often does. In an age where so many of the tools that we'd normally use have been taken from us. So it's an age in which the truth just isn't quite enough anymore. Because people say, well, that might be true, but I don't care. There's a higher value, and it's how I feel. That's how I feel about it. It's an age in which all the research and studies and all the rest of it can only take us so far. People don't care anymore. It's an age in which so many of the tools that we used to use are taken from us. It's an age in which we can't even remind people of the past because they don't care for the past. It's all about the me and the here and the now. But those tools, they might be worn out, they might be blunted, they might be indeed taken from us. But the Apostle Paul says there's one that remains. And I'm so glad it's the one that remains. I'm so glad that people are more and more being channeled towards this one that remains. Because it's one that doesn't rely on your power. It's one that doesn't rely on your strength. It's one that doesn't rely on my will. It's the power of God. It's one that's above my jurisdiction and outside of my pay grade. And it's the power of God for salvation. In what? The gospel. But here's something, and I hope this isn't controversial. What is the gospel? Paul's about to tell us. And he doesn't say, Jesus came, Jesus died, Jesus rose again, the end. He goes on for 16 chapters as he unpacks his thesis statement about the gospel. And he starts by talking about the truth of God as creator and God's righteousness revealed in his wrath against sin, then his righteousness revealed in faith in chapter 4, his righteousness revealed in Christ in chapter 5, his righteousness revealed in our lives as we're changed in chapter 7 and 6, and then his righteousness revealed in his dealings through history in 9, 10, 11. Then he gets to chapter 12. And you know what? By that stage, he hasn't asked us to do a single thing. Not one thing. It's just been a flood of theology. This is what God has done, or as he describes it in chapter 12, verse 1, the mercies of God. This is all that he's done, all that he's done, all that he's done. And then he says, therefore. And I tell you what, he opens up the machine gun of do this, do that, do this, do that, until you're left to just flat on the floor, dizzy. Because the gospel, the first principles are Christ, his death and resurrection. But in a pagan culture, they don't just need to know about Christ Redeemer, they need to know about God Creator. And they need to know about his way, according to Romans 1. Just as much. And not, oh, that's a bell. Must be, check your time, Jonathan, we'll be right. 5 minutes early. They need to know about that, but you know what else they need to know about? They need to see God revealed in the changed lives of those who have been saved. They need to see God revealed in actions that shine like a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden, as Jesus says. They need it in their face. They need pride from Christians, so we're not hiding in plain sight. And that is the full measure of the gospel call on our lives. And when we say all of this, and when we live all of this, and by the way, it includes the way we live in civil society and how we relate to the state, Romans 13, it's all in there. When we're so changed, you can bet that all of a sudden, God's work will be done in God's way. And we don't need to overstress about exactly what will happen. I've had so many stories from people all around the place where I think, I never would have imagined that happening. Well, good, because it's God's work. And we just need to be there to be used so that his power is at work in the world. And that's why our motto is truth made public, because if the truth is made public, and if that's made public in word and deed and life, you can be sure things will change. You can be sure the work of God will be done in this time and in this age. And that's why we do everything we do. And that's why we don't just go out there with studies and articles and secular reason. We do all of that. But there's nobody who should be in any doubt that the reason this all makes sense is because God is the author, we trust, of all that we say and think in this world, and that it is because of the change that's been brought into our lives that we do what we do. Then you'll see the spiritual sickness of this age may just start to be unpicked, unpacked, and God will transform people by his power, not by yours or by mine. Thank you very much.
Hey, one more thing. I've been looking at the metrics and I figured out something. You guys are watching the videos and not subscribing. So please help us out a great deal by hitting the like button and then hitting subscribe, hitting the bell as well so you get the notifications. It helps us out a really great deal, and you can click here to see more videos.